Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio with you as we have our second basketball podcast of the year. This is a complicated time of year for those of us who work in the IU podcasting industry and actually care about more than one sport. As we taped a football podcast last night, I'm going to tape a football podcast tonight. But in the middle, we're going to talk some basketball, and that's going to increasingly be the thing that we focus the most on just because there's a lot of games and there's a lot of things to talk about, and it's a particularly interesting season on a number of levels and probably a pivotal season for the Archie Miller era in Bloomington. We are pleased to be joined with a guy that we've had on multiple times in the past. You know him from his excellent work last year writing for Inside the Hall and Assembly Call. Ben Ladner joining us from the glorious South. Ben, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here. How are you?
Yeah, doing great. Just trying to get used to these fall temperatures. It's definitely basketball season and football season simultaneously. The leaves are turning. Do the leaves turn where you're at?
I was going to say that I don't think this wave has made it down to the south quite yet. We're getting into like the 70s down here on a consistent basis. So we're working our way to fall temperatures. Maybe by December we'll get there.
It feels like we skipped the 70s. We went like right from the 90s to the 50s, which I'm a little iffy on that, but hey, I'm just one person. Anyway, let's talk IU. And first and foremost, before we get into the meat of our conversation, for those of you who did not know this, the Ken Pomeroy rankings dropped a couple of days ago, and Indiana pops up as the projected 34th best team in the country. The Ken Pom overall aggregate projects IU with the 43rd best offense and 28th best defense in the country, a projected regular season record of 19-12 and 10-10. I'm assuming you saw these rankings, Ben, so I guess my question to you is, were you surprised one way or the other by them, and what do you think about those overall estimates given what you think you know about this team?
I was a little surprised. 34, like that's pretty high for a team that I think a lot of people are expecting maybe not to make the tournament this year. Like I think, just from an anecdotal standpoint, I don't think you look at this Indiana team as an NCAA tournament team, but 34 out of, whatever there are 320 NCAA teams, that's within the NCAA field. The offense, I don't know that it gets as high as 43, to be honest. I don't really see like a ton, like the one guy like you had last year with Juwan Morgan or Romeo Langford to kind of anchor this offense. But I think there's also an argument that, weirdly enough, the offense could be better despite losing those guys. I don't know that that's necessarily the most convincing argument to me, but I think it is out there. So I could see them maybe getting as high as, that 43 mark. But, I think both of these, 43rd on offense, 28th on defense, are probably closer to best case scenarios than they are to, median outcomes. But, if you get both of those things, sure, I could see them getting as high as 34 in the country.
Yeah, it is interesting because if you look at the Ken Pom rating last year for IU finishing up the season, they were 82nd in offense and 32nd in defense. So, going from 32nd to 28th, that's a modest increase on defense. In fact, I think some might argue that they expect IU to improve more than that defensively. But a jump from 82nd to 43rd on the offensive side of the ball would be roughly akin to that's a bigger jump than IU's made in a while, and would be almost a doubling of the effectiveness of the offense within the ranking system, which does, you do kind of scratch your head about that. It's not impossible, certainly, but it's one of those things where it would be a surprise given that we're still not sure exactly where the scorings come on this team.
Yeah, and I think even if you do figure out who your scorers are, and even if you do have guys who can do that capably, I just don't see enough shooting on this team for whatever scoring weapons you have, whether it's Devontae Green, Deron Davis, maybe it's Jerome Hunter in his first year. Even if those guys blossom, I don't know that this team's going to have, the requisite shooting to really give those guys the breathing room they're going to need to lead this team to a top 50 offense. So I think from that standpoint, it's just going to be really tough to create efficient looks on a consistent basis, even if you have the guys who theoretically, in a kind of a normal offensive ecosystem would be able to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about the one rather fragmentary piece of evidence that we have thus far about this IU basketball team, and that comes in the form of the secret scrimmage and I got some big scare quotes going on with my fingers right now as I say that they had against Marquette in the in Bankers Life Fieldhouse over the course of the last, well, I guess it was the weekend. But what do we take out of the numbers that we saw in that game? Theoretically, this is a simulated game. Basically, IU loses, but Armand Franklin leads IU in points. You've got some other interesting statistical things going on. A lot of people have zeroed in on the free throw situation that took place in that contest. I mean, what did you take out of that environment? Was there anything that you think we should be concentrating on, or things that jumped out at you?
I didn't take a whole lot, to be honest, man. I think it's so early in the year that these teams are not even close to, what their final form is going to be. And that matters for Indiana because, they need to develop as a team as well. But it also means they're not playing against a team that is going to be what they eventually will turn into for Marquette. And I think that's a team that's going to come together as the course of the season goes on as well. And so it is hard to take too much away from something like this. I just spent a lot of time watching the NBA preseason before the season started last night. And you see all the time guys who have really electric preseasons who light it up in scoring or, are playing really good defense or just seem to click. Sometimes once you get to the start of the actual season, it takes a reset. And those guys kind of have to start back from square one. They don't look quite as good as they did, in those games that didn't necessarily count. So I think if you're talking about Armand Franklin, that could be an instance of maybe an example of that where he looks really good in this type of setting, but it's going to take a while for him to be able to do that consistently. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of guys on this team where one game is not necessarily a sample size you can use as something that's going to be indicative of what you're going to see the entire season.
Let's use that as a jumping off point to talk about the new pieces on this IU roster. And really, what we're looking at, there's actually more, it feels like more new pieces or quasi-new pieces than you would think of at first glance with this team, because obviously you've got Armand Franklin and Trace Jackson Davis coming in as freshmen, but then you can also add Joey Bronk, who's a transfer. I think you need to add Jerome Hunter, who, even though he's a redshirt freshman, didn't see any playing time last year. And I think you could even throw Race Thompson into this mix, who, while he did play at the tail end of last season, we really didn't get a chance to see a whole lot of what he could do. And in fact, he really didn't play very many minutes outside of one or two games. So let's kind of go down this path to start with. What are you looking for, and what does IU have to have from these players? Are there certain players that you think are more important to a successful IU season than others? And what are you hoping to see develop as far as the way that they're able to approach the game?
My biggest question is whether any of them can shoot the ball. And for that reason, I think Armand Franklin could actually be a more important piece than some people might think, just because if there is one guy in that group you identify as a potential shooter, a guy who could step in and knock down shots, even if he doesn't do anything else particularly well, that could be of real value for a team that, like I said, is just going to really lack in shooting, at least the way they're kind of constructed right now and from the evidence we have at the moment. Maybe you could say Jerome Hunter's going to step in and be that guy who also, from the looks of it, can create a little bit of offense for himself off the dribble, appears to be an okay passer. But I don't see him as being quite that knockdown shooter that you really need. And you just go through the roster, like Al Durham has been inconsistent. Same goes for Rob Finney. Devontae Green is really the only guy on this team that can create and hit three-pointers reliably. And so if you can get a guy, like Armand Franklin to step in and just provide some sort of offensive punch as a shooter, space the floor out, provide that breathing room like I talked about earlier, that could be really, really important. And then I think if you're looking at who's going to get the most minutes, I think it's going to come in the front court, either Trace Jackson Davis or Joey Bronk. I've been a little bit lower on Jackson Davis coming into the season just because I think with guys like that, the hyped high school prospect, like it's always best to temper expectations, and especially because he's probably going to come off the bench. And, that's such a packed front court rotation right now. It's going to be hard for him, unless he just really explodes from day one, to really get the consistent minutes he's going to need to be like a high level impact freshman. Joey Bronk, is an experienced guy. From everything I've heard, Archie Miller really likes him and what he's brought to practice and kind of the presence he can be inside. So I could see him playing a pretty significant role, especially on the boards. This is a team that's going to need to replace a lot of rebounding production from last year. And then whatever scoring he gives you, next to that, is just going to be a bonus.
So it's interesting you mentioned Armand Franklin shooting. I'm going to go back to that for a second. Not a bad shooter by any means at the high school level for a guard. His field goal percentage was 54% both his junior year and his senior year, and that was on a pretty significant amount of field goal attempts, 360 his junior year, 397 his senior year. Not quite as good from outside, but still okay. 39% his senior year. It is interesting because when you look at the way that IU's guards have had their careers go, Devontae Green, if you're going to talk about his just effective field goal percentage, he took a really big dip his sophomore year, and he still hasn't quite recovered from how he shot his freshman year. I mean, his effective field goal percentage as a freshman was 55.7, dipped all the way to 43.9 as a sophomore, and then back up to 51.1. But he was shooting threes at a 44% clip and shooting twos at a 45% clip as a freshman. Last year, 41% from three, 39% from three. The lack of shooting, particularly from the outside, is definitely problematic. But it also seems, I guess, it would be interesting if Armand Franklin ends up finding himself in the lineup because he's able to shoot his way into it, given how flexible and fluid the roster situation seems to be overall as far as who's going to be out there and where the strengths of the roster seem to lie.
Yeah, and I think that guard rotation is going to be pretty fluid as the year goes on. I'm really interested to see who starts because from the looks of it, I think Rob Finney, Devontae Green, and Al Durham are probably in line to start in that three-guard look, but that does not leave you very much, optionality coming off the bench. And so, that could just be an instance where you need Franklin to play because you don't have any other guards who can come off the bench and give you reliable minutes. Maybe they bring a guy like Al Durham off the bench just to get another creator on that second unit so you can kind of stagger the minutes of Durham, Green, and Finney a little bit better. I think either way, especially if all three of them start, though, you're going to see someone get kind of the quick hook, spend 3-4 minutes on the bench and then come in and sub one of the other guys out just so you can kind of keep one of them on, hopefully two of them on the floor at all times. But that's going to be a really sort of interesting dynamic as far as how Archie balances those three guards. And again, I think that's maybe an avenue for Franklin to get some playing time just because you need someone to be that fourth guard. And right now, I don't think there's like a glaringly obvious candidate to be that guy.
How do you expect the lineup to work as far as that shift between guards and post players? I mean, it's like if you accept the idea that there's three primary groups on this roster, you've got your guards that you just mentioned, you've got your kind of swingman situation, which is weird in and of itself because you throw Jerome Hunter into that mix. You'd throw Demezy Anderson into that mix. You'd throw Justin Smith into that mix. And then you've got your post players, but you could also put Justin Smith into that group as well, along with Joey Bronk, Trace Jackson Davis, Deron Davis. A lot of people have speculated about whether or not IU and Archie Miller decide to go big with some of these lineups. Obviously, it's going to be situational to some degree, but what do you expect IU's default lineup to be, and why do you think that will be effective for them?
That's a really good question. I think when push comes to shove, they'll probably go with Finney, Green, and Durham in that three-guard look, just because those are their best players. I don't think this is a team where you necessarily worry about fit as much as just getting the best talent on the floor. So I think starting and closing games, that's probably going to be the first thing they go to. But I do think Archie is serious when he says he wants to play bigger, and that could be a strength for this team. And I also think, just given the nature of the Big Ten, the way teams play stylistically in that league, it's such a physical league, and it's really there are some really dynamic guards, but I guess stylistically it sort of favors big men because you can put two bigs on the floor and you're not really worried about that dynamic combo forward who's going to just burn your power forward off the dribble. Maybe like Lamar Stevens at Penn State would be a decent example, but even he has his shortcomings offensively. So I do think if there's one league among the Power Five in the country that you can really get away with playing two or even three big men, it is the Big Ten. I just I look at a guy like Justin Smith, like right now I don't think there's any way he can play the three unless he shoots it, and so far he's proven that he is not really a shooting threat. The one guy you could maybe shoehorn into that small forward spot is Jerome Hunter. But aside from that, it's really you have to play three guards or you have to play three non-shooters. And so that puts Indiana in a really tough bind because they're either giving something up defensively or they're giving up something, offensively in terms of their floor spacing and just the amount of room that those guards have to operate. So unless Hunter really shoots it and you can play him at the three and really trust what you're getting out of that spot, I think Indiana is just going to have to pick between playing really big and playing really small. And that could depend on the opponent. That could depend on who's playing well. It could depend on just what Archie wants to try in that given moment. But I think if there is one weakness I guess maybe one of the most glaring weaknesses, because I think there are several with this team, but perhaps the most obvious weakness of this team is that there are no really like small forward size and small forward skilled players on the team. Like you have to pick between having the size of a three or having the skill of a three, and those guys, they just don't come, in one player like you'd want them to.
At least not that we know of. I mean, certainly we haven't.
And I think Hunter could be that guy. Like I said, I mean, if he really steps forward and if he's as good as what the team has said he is, and as good as he's looked in practice and various social media videos, which you always have to take with a grain of salt. But if he really is that kind of player, then that changes a lot for this team. It's just we don't have a lot of evidence at the moment that he is going to be that player for a sustained amount of time.
Let's talk about Joey Bronk for a little bit. We saw him in some cases at Butler, and I don't think we ever. Ironically, we might have seen the best of Joey Bronk last year in the game he played against Indiana. But by and large, even though his percentage of minutes went up and his offense was pretty good if you look at it from an offensive rating perspective, overall not a player that's had a tremendous number of like highly effective games over the course of his career. He did have a pretty good game at Seton Hall. He got in the double figures in, I think, the last regular season game in a loss at Providence. But what is it that we're going to see, in your opinion, out of Joey Bronk? What does he bring to the table? Does his game translate effectively to playing in the Big Ten?
I don't have a great read on his game at the moment, to be honest. But I do think, just given his size and kind of the role he seemed to play at Butler, I do think, like I said, that style kind of lends itself to Big Ten basketball. He's going to need to be better on the glass. For a guy who really doesn't take any threes, his total rebound percentage for his career is 12.6 according to Basketball Reference. And so, if he's not going to space the floor for you, and if he's not going to be like a super high usage type of scorer, I think you need him to rebound the ball a little bit better. I think he can be an effective option in the post. Only, about 20% usage last season, and has never been higher than 23.5. But really, that was in his 7-game freshman year at Butler. So he's not really going to be a high usage sort of scoring big man. He's pretty efficient. I think the opportunities he does get, he's going to be able to convert. It's just that he's going to need to provide more than just, if you pass the ball to this guy on the dump off, he's going to make the layup. Like, that can't be the only thing he brings to the table. He's going to need to rebound. I don't think he's really going to be a shooter. I think that guys at this stage in their career don't really add that element to their game. But maybe they go to him a little bit more often, try and make him a focal point in the offense. Maybe they use his just kind of his size and his girth to screen and kind of juice the offense that way. But to me, he's got to kind of find ways to impact the game that aren't necessarily like the most obvious things that show up, in the box score.
I will say something that I'm intrigued about with him. He was one of the best offensive rebounders, certainly in the Big East last year, and that was not something Indiana did particularly well last year. I mean, you look across the board at offensive rebounding, Juwan Morgan was fine at it. Justin Smith got some, but overall as a team, IU's offensive rebounding percentage was pretty much smack dab in the middle of Division I. And, it feels like that's an area that IU could improve their efficiency offensively without having to necessarily shoot better. In fact, it would be the reverse of that to some degree because they'd be collecting their own misses. But that does seem like an area where Bronk could really make a contribution, is if he can certainly not just replace Juwan Morgan's offensive rebounding, but maybe even accentuate the percentages a bit. Suddenly that gives them more looks at the basket and more chances to convert on a possession.
Yeah, and if you look back over the last couple of years, this really wasn't a team that was built to crash the offensive glass because they spent so much time, especially after Jerron Davis got injured a couple of years ago. They spent so much time playing small. Juwan Morgan played so many minutes at the 5 that you really just, you couldn't afford to crash the offensive glass because that was just such a sort of a high risk, low reward proposition that if they really spend a lot of effort doing that, it compromises their transition defense and all that. And they just, like, they weren't a team that was built to get offensive rebounds. So they basically kind of punted on that area of the game. And I think
the one guy that would do that was Freddie McSwain, but that was largely because that was about all that he could do.
And most of those were his own misses.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that could be something they go back to this year because, like I said, they just have so many big bodies in that front court. I mean, you look at Deron Davis, Race Thompson, Trace Jackson Davis, Joey Bronk. All those guys, I think, are going to play minutes in the rotation. And so you got a little bit more power, a little bit more size in the front court there. And maybe this is especially like you said, they don't have a ton of shooting. And so if they feel like they can't really get that 3-point shooting to uptick, maybe they just try to bludgeon teams underneath and create as many extra opportunities as possible.
Which is, it's certainly something that works for certain teams. I mean, and this is where I think it's going to be interesting for Indiana because it's like, what are you expecting to get out of this season? Obviously, increasing your offensive efficiency has to be one of those things. And we saw several teams last year who, made some decent leaps in offensive efficiency, and a lot of that seemed to come down to two things. And they're both things that I think this Indiana team could fix. One of them is offensive rebounding, and the other is turnover percentage. Indiana, their turnovers, I don't think they weren't like god awful at that part of the game last year, but they could have been better. They had a 17.9% turnover rate, which certainly was higher than you would have liked, but not as high as it could have been, I guess. But that's an area that you feel like you could definitely improve upon. And you get those two together. I mean, that's two of the four factors. And suddenly you're keeping possession more and you're doing more with the possessions that you get. It feels like this roster could potentially be able to fix a little bit in both of those areas.
Yeah, and I think for a team like Indiana, who's not really creating, high efficiency, high percentage shots on a consistent basis, you really can't afford to turn the ball over, as much as they did last season or, even 2 years ago. Like that's got to be the one thing that you really are rock solid on offensively, because if you're not going to get, high percentage looks, if you're giving away and just basically creating a net zero value possession, like those possessions are going to kill you. So you have to hang on to the ball and just kind of, I guess, go off of the San Antonio Spurs model, which is basically like, we're not going to take a ton of threes. We're not going to make a ton of threes, but we're going to get like an okay shot at the very least on pretty much every possession. And if you can do that and force the other team into enough misses or into enough turnovers and kind of create offense going the other way, via the turnover game, that could be a formula to success. It's really hard to do. It's tough to pull off. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of focus, and it kind of reduces your margin of error. But that might be Indiana's best path to kind of getting to that. We mentioned that 43 mark in offensive efficiency that they're projected at. Maybe that's the best way for them to get there, is just eliminating turnovers and kind of raising the average value of a possession, I guess a little higher than it would be if they were just giving away zeros on a consistent basis.
It's interesting because if you take the other side of the ball, the turnover situation is also one where Indiana could make a lot of strides and better their numbers over last year. As good of a defensive team as IU ended up being last year, 32nd in the country in defensive efficiency, they did not turn opponents over particularly well. They only forced a turnover percentage of 18.1%. That was 195th in the country. And that, they tended to defend shots very well. They were a top 60 team in terms of opponents' effective field goal percentage, but they weren't forcing a lot of turnovers. And I am interested. We talk a lot about offense. We talk a lot about shooting, and those have certainly been the things that have been the most obvious glaring issues for Indiana the first 2 years under the Archie Miller regime. But the ability to force turnovers was something that they were able to do in his first year. They were a top 100 team there, and they seemed to lose a bit of the understanding of how to go about that last season.
Yeah, they were definitely more of a sort of stay solid, be in position type of team, force a tough shot and get the rebound sort of defense rather than, a super frenetic, like Illinois type of defense. And there's a balance to be struck there, I think. Generally, I tend to prefer teams that, like Indiana, are just going to stay solid. They're not going to gamble. They're going to be in position. They're going to, sort of take away the high efficiency shots and live with opponents shooting sort of those low to medium efficiency looks. Whereas, a team like Illinois, they're just so all over the place that if they don't get the turnover, they kind of have no backup plan, and then the other team's shooting a layup. So, Indiana, I think, errs on probably the better side of that spectrum, but I do think there's a balance there. And, maybe some low-hanging fruit there would be if they're going to go ahead and bring the big up, like when they hedge pick and rolls, to me, if you're going to bring the big all the way out there, go ahead and trap. Try to force the turnover and like go ahead and bother the ball handler, put two people on the ball, and that can create corner threes. But Indiana's already giving up those shots because the big man's already out there anyway. So to me, like you might as well try to double and trap and force a turnover that way, and then you're basically making the same rotations if you don't get the turnover as you would be if you just hedge. So I don't think Indiana's going to change that part of their defensive strategy. That's a pretty crucial element of what they do and what Archie Miller believes in. But I think if they're looking for a way to kind of ratchet up intensity, bother opponents, and kind of speed them up, that might be a way to do it. But again, this is always going to be a team that slows it down, that wants to kind of control the pace and make the opponent work for sort of medium to low efficiency shots, like I said. And if they can do that, I think they're going to be happy. And that's, like I said, generally that's the way to go, I think, on defense. Kind of execute your scheme, stay in position, and live with the results.
You mentioned earlier on that there were other flaws that this team has, and at the risk of wallowing in the negative, what else are you concerned about that people need to be watching out for with this Indiana roster?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, shooting to me just really the shooting on this team really scares me, and that kind of is disproportionately weighted, I guess. I mean, that's a bigger concern than maybe something like lack of rebounding might be. I just think in this day and age of basketball, you need to be able to shoot the ball. But I think depth, like there are not a lot of proven guys in this rotation right now, right? I mean, there are guys who in theory, Armand Franklin, Trace Jackson Davis, Denise Anderson, Race Thompson, all those guys could be rotation players this year and give you serviceable production in limited minutes. I don't know that any of them necessarily will. And I don't think you can necessarily count on all those guys to slot in and just, kind of hit the ground running. Justin Smith is a guy who really struggled to put it together last year. I don't think he can afford to have the type of, especially like in the last 10 games of last season, I don't think he can afford to have that type of year again. If Al Durham doesn't really take the next step, like this team's counting on him to be, if he kind of flattens out as what he was last year, I don't think that's enough. Rob Finney is a guy I do believe in to take a step forward. I think he's really solid, but there's just going to be a lot riding on Devontae Green. And, the Indiana fan base kind of feels different ways about Devontae Green. I tend to think he's the best player on this team. And I also kind of believe in him more than most people do, but I would concede that if Devontae Green's the best guy on this team, like how high can you really go? And especially when it's not really clear who that number two guy is, I think there's just, it's tough to see kind of where that scoring comes from. Who is the one, sort of indomitable player that you can give the ball to? Maybe it's Devontae, but I think even in that role, he would struggle a little bit and be more inconsistent than he was last season.
It's definitely one of those things. I don't know if I've yet to get panicked about it. I do think that there's a certain strength in collectivism in basketball at a certain point. And I think when I look at Indiana, as I've looked more and more at the realities of this season, the realities of the roster, it's a young roster. It's still a roster that's building around kind of a shared identity, a focused identity on defense. Obviously, as you mentioned, the shooting isn't quite there, but I do think that to some degree you can be a good team, good enough at least to get into the NCAA tournament as an at-large team without necessarily having a go-to guy or a couple of go-to guys, in as much as if you've got something to anchor yourself to, and you've got good enough players on the roster. I mean, I think, Devontae Green might be the best offensive player on the roster, certainly the guy that has shown the greatest ability to shoot. But look, I mean, you get a sophomore year, Rob Finney. There's probably going to be a leap there. You're going to get another year of Justin Smith, which obviously Justin Smith has been frustrating at a lot of points in his game, but has also, I mean, as we've talked about before, if you take his three-point shooting out of the mix last year, he's a 54% shooter from the field, and he's a guy who pulled down a decent amount of offensive rebounds. There's some tweaks to his game that can be made that, perhaps he's more comfortable with. So there's a lot of pieces there. And I get what you're saying. I'm certainly I don't I don't know what we're going to get out of Jerome Hunter. I don't know what Indiana gets out of any of the newcomers because it's just hard to say until they're actually on the floor. But IU's not really competing for a protected seed this year. I don't think they're competing for a Big Ten title. They're really just competing to get back into the field. And it does feel like within the other groups of teams that are going to be trying to do that same thing, I think their makeup is no better or worse than a lot of those teams at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I agree, there's a lot of power sort of in the collective and being able to mesh together and be greater than some of your parts. And like I said, for, a point earlier, like Indiana could be that team. It could happen. I just think if I had to bet on it, I don't know that this is necessarily that team who kind of coalesces and becomes, greater than what their individual pieces would suggest. It could be in the realm of possibility, but I think it's maybe less than a 50% chance that it actually happens. And also, I think the teams that tend to, be greater than the sum of your parts, like you're talking about, those teams kind of have a clearer identity and maybe fit together a little bit better on the court, have more shooting in most cases, and they kind of make up for that lack of star talent by just being really solid, in every other area. And to me, Indiana's shaky in just a few too many other areas for me to really buy them as a team that can really get past that lack of top-end talent.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, if they're solid on defense, if they're in that top 30 defensively, that gives them a really nice platform.
Yeah, and I think that's actually realistic because of how many bigs they're going to play. I really do believe that playing multiple big guys, and again, especially in the Big Ten where they're just, there's not a lot of teams that play that pro style where they space you out and really take your slower guys off the dribble. That's just not really in vogue in Big Ten basketball right now. So I think you can get away with playing two big guys at once. And I do think playing two big men at the same time helps your defense. It helps your rebounding. It helps you take away the rim, which are, that's the most efficient shot type in basketball. And obviously rebounding is sort of the punctuation mark at the end of a defensive sentence. So that's probably their most realistic path to getting in the tournament is just playing big, relying on their defense, really being solid on the interior, and hoping that kind of lifts what will likely be, a so-so offense above water and they can get into the tournament.
Going to be an interesting set of games to start with. And maybe that's the last thing we'll talk about here, Ben. I mean, the schedule is set up where if they don't win all 7 of their opening games, something went wrong. Western Illinois, Portland State, North Alabama, Troy, Princeton, Louisiana Tech, South Dakota State. Maybe Louisiana Tech and maybe Princeton could give you some hassle there, but that's a pretty soft start to the season. But I think you could argue, given what we've just been talking about, probably exactly what this team needs to coalesce and try to figure out how to play together.
Yeah, I think last season, if this time last year, you'd look at this schedule and say, why aren't they playing better teams? This is going to be a good team with Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan. They should be testing themselves early. I think it's the opposite this season. I agree with you. I think they need time to sort of get on the same page, to build momentum, build confidence, because they've got a big one against Florida State, coming right off that sort of weaker stretch to start the year in Bloomington. And that's not going to be an easy game. And I think Indiana probably will be the underdog heading into that. So, it's always tough to kind of project that far out and 7 games into the season, because we saw even last year, like there were some close calls against the Louisiana Techs, the Troys of the world in Assembly Hall. And I think this is a less talented team than they had last year. And so their margin of error is a little bit lower because they don't have a guy like Juwan Morgan who you can just sort of say, bail us out and help us win this game. They are really going to need to play well in each of these games to get the win. Now they are more talented. They do have the edge there, but I don't think the talent disparity is maybe as great as it's been in years past. They really do need to kind of play good basketball rather than just sort of rely on their talent.
We will be back with more basketball talk throughout the season. Obviously, we'll have some more podcasts next week. And we'll have Ben back on as well, as he'll be keeping tabs on the Hoosiers from afar as Indiana heads into the 2019-2020 season. Ben, thanks for taking the time to talk.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you folks for listening in. You are listening to CrimsonCast. I'm Galen Clavier. We'll catch you on the flip side. So long, everybody.